Welcome to There Is a Method to the Madness. I am Rob Maxwell. I'm an exercise physiologist. In the Method to the Madness, I explore with you why things may or may not work in the realm of health and fitness. I use science to explain what you really need to know about current events in fitness and what you should simply ignore. Today's podcast is brought to you by Jonathan and Lynn Gilden at the Gilden Group at Realty Pros. They currently have over 275 star reviews on Zillow and over 100 million sold between the two of them. They are fit, they hustle, and they're ready to go out there and get you what you need. They can be reached at 386-451-2412 or at thegildengroup.com. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to pick up on the old smartwatch 101. Is your smartwatch making you look dumb, or are you utilizing the tool for exactly as you should? Because that's what it is. It's a tool. It's a tool to help you get more fit, but like everything, you need to learn how to use it, right? So let's talk about that. We've already covered VO2 max and what that really is and how accurate that is on your watch. We have covered the old GPS functioning, and I thought a lot of the research on that was really interesting as far as the history of that goes. And we have covered the old heart rate. So today, this is going to be the final piece on smartwatch, is going to be on an important part of it, and maybe the biggest reason why people get these things, and that's how many calories you burn during your workouts and at rest, because the Apple Watches and some of the others are telling you basically what your passive expenditure is, and that's how many calories you're burning at rest, and that is based on your body weight and your age, and it's thrown into a formula and it gives you some data. And then it's also giving you your active calories burned, and that is based on some metabolic calculations that are in the formulas for your watches. And I'm going to talk about the accuracy of those things. So they can be very helpful. And when I work with people to lose weight, I make it mandatory that they track their food. MyFitnessPal is the one I usually use because that's the one I use, and then I can track people. But they have to simply record their food. People that aren't willing to record their food and keep it in some sort of a journal really aren't that serious about losing weight. And it really is a mathematical formula when it comes to calories. It absolutely works. It works great. I can give you story after story of people who have recorded their diets in MyFitnessPal, and I didn't even have to change what they ate very much. I just watched it, and they tended to actually watch themselves knowing that they're going to be more vulnerable and somebody's going to be looking at their diet, so they tended to make better choices, and next thing you know, they're down to where they needed to be weight-wise. So it's an absolute necessary tool. It works great. Let me give you one little statistic on that before I talk about expenditure, and that is most people underestimate how much they eat by 30%. So we experts in this field always look at that when people are recording foods and say, well, it's probably about 30% more, unless they're scanning the labels, which some of these apps can do for you. But if they're recording it and say it's a cup of cereal, probably a cup and a third. So that's the statistics on that little, mental note for yourself. So when you are adding stuff and putting it in, if you're really trying to lose weight, kind of be tough on yourself and say it's probably about a third more, because that's what we do nationwide in our country as far as the studies go. So little tip on that. Now let's talk about expenditure. So input is what you eat. You're putting it in your MyFitnessPal, or you're not, but input is what you eat. It's the only way we get kilocalories. It's the only way we get energy is by eating or drinking them. Output comes in 3 different ways. All right. The first off is the greatest amount of expenditure comes from your resting metabolic rate, or you may see it as basal metabolic rate. Either way, it absolutely means the same thing. Basal just means rest, and that accounts for 60 to 70% of the calories you burn come from your resting metabolic rate. So when somebody says, and usually they say it falsely, they don't understand it well enough, or they think they do, but they don't. I have a slow metabolism, or I have a fast metabolism. That's what they're referring to, is their resting metabolic rate. Now, that may not be true. They might be like a very hyper person. They might have some ADHD, or they're a little anxious. They are hyper. Nothing wrong with that. But that's not metabolism. That means they're simply moving more throughout the day. That's not your metabolic rate. Your metabolic rate is what's happening internally as you rest. And again, that's 60 to 70%. So it really is important that that number stays as high as it can. And guess what? The number one driver to your resting metabolic rate isn't a silly diet. You know, I literally have seen supposed experts state jalapeno peppers will raise your metabolism because they're hot. Who believes that stuff? How dumb do you have to be to believe that? I mean, that's ridiculous. That has nothing to do with anything, okay? The only way we raise our resting metabolic rate is to increase our muscle mass. Muscle mass is metabolic. It is live tissue. It requires calories. So the more muscle you have, the faster your metabolism is going to be. Now, I'm going to get into the watches, but that's the first error you have to think about. The watches are based on your body weight when you're burning calories. You put in your body weight. So let's say you put in 200 pounds. Okay, it goes into a formula and says, well, at 200 pounds, you're going to be burning this much energy, this many calories for this given activity. The problem is 200 pounds isn't 200 pounds across the board. You could be 200 pounds and 5% body fat, which means you're extremely muscular, you're ripped, you look like a cornerback in football, you look like a track star, you look like a bodybuilder, whatever. Or you could be 200 pounds and 20% body fat, which isn't overly obese, but it is a little overweight. It's definitely not 5%. You definitely have a lot more body fat. You definitely don't have the metabolism of a 200 pounder at 5% body fat. So there's a big difference between the two. So that's the first error you just have to be alerted to. Nothing you can really do about it as far as your watch setting goes. And of course, there's a lot you can do about it, or there is something you can do about it as far as your general health goes, and that means always try to increase your muscle mass, okay? I'm going to stay on that for a second. Here's some interesting stats for you. 1 pound of lean tissue, so lean tissue is muscle, 1 pound of lean tissue increases your metabolic rate by 6 calories per pound. You think 6 calories, big deal. Well, add it up. The average RMR for somebody, for a male, is around 2,000, 2,200 calories a day. That's not bad, depending on their age, but that's about the average. For a female, it's around 1,400 calories, all right? So if you add 10 pounds of muscle, now you've added 60 calories per day. So now that's looking a lot better, right? So you think, well, what does that do? Well, do the math. So 60 pounds per day, keep going, keep going, keep going. That really makes a big difference, right? Matter of fact, some of the ways that people gain weight is called creeping obesity. So people don't realize that they're eating a little bit more every day than they used to. And they gain 5 pounds a month, 5 pounds the next month. So this all happens not from like just gaining all this weight in a short period of time, but slowly but surely. So 50 calories a day really does matter. And the only way we raise our metabolic rate is to add muscle. So think about that. Think about that. I'm putting that in your head right now. I know we're talking about watches, but that is going to impact the amount of total burn you have. Is whether or not your 200 pounds or 140 pounds or whatever it might be is more muscular or more subcutaneous body fat. It does matter. Now, let me stay on that for 1 second before I move on to more of the watch accuracy. I used to have a basal metabolic rate machine, and I could test somebody's metabolism and tell them exactly what their RMR is. I say used to because, believe it or not, it was so busy I didn't have time to do as many as I really was scheduling, and it became problematic, so I had to get rid of it. It is still local, I'll tell you that. I also found that a lot of people, when given the information, didn't exactly change their behavior. So I'm thinking, okay, this is great, get a little $50 for 20 minutes of work or whatever, but at the same time, it wasn't very rewarding because not too many people were changing. So in any event, don't have it anymore. That's a little caveat to the RMR metabolic cart that I had. What I was able to determine, though, something that came out of those testing days for me that will stick with me, is that I could tell when somebody had either a quasi or a legitimate eating disorder or they were on a low-carb diet, because their metabolism would be very low. For example, I had two women that came in that knew each other. Both of them weighed between 115 and 120 pounds. They were both pretty petite, pretty lean. So it's almost the same body weight, almost the same height. I mean, they were like twins. One of them, and again, this is a female, had a super high metabolic rate of close to 2,000 kilocalories a day at rest. She can burn at around 115, 116 pounds. 2,000. That's up where a heavier guy's going to be, a heavier male's going to be. The other one was just barely over 1,000. We're talking 1,000 calorie difference on somebody of almost the same frame. Matter of fact, the other one, the one who had the not so good metabolism, was slightly leaner. So it's like, well, what's with that? So did some questioning and talking, and it turned out the one with the lower metabolism had definitely struggled with an eating disorder. So what happens is, when we're not eating enough, or in the case of a bulimic, where they are eating but they're not keeping it down, what ends up happening is they lose muscle. So I'm sure everybody understands that a person it's a disease, it's like addiction. So, there's a lot of multifaceted reasons as to why this happens. But the thought process is that they believe they're overweight when they're not. So what they're fearing is that they're going to be, gain weight easily. And then what ends up happening is they starve themselves or they don't keep it down. They end up lowering their metabolism and then increasing their fear and chances even more. So it's such a double-edged sword. And, with this person and others who I've worked with, I've told, I can't help you until you get some medical help because this is a serious problem. So just a little sidebar on that. But what struck me during these days, and this was not a singular incident, this happened quite often, more than I would hope. It happened quite a bit, and it's alarming how many problems we have with this in our country with young women. Was the eating disorder is definitely prevalent. 50% or so of college-age women have disordered eating patterns, which is very, very high. So when I was able to locate this and see this, I was able to explain, look, when you are not eating what you need to eat, when you don't have an appropriate amount of calories, what ends up happening is your body goes through gluconeogenesis, which means that your body literally starts eating itself. So it starts eating the muscle tissue to create the carbohydrates that are necessary to fuel the body. So you end up lowering your metabolism. Now, this isn't just in the case of extreme eating disorders. This is also in the case, and listen up, people, listen to this, of the case of the low carb people. If you're doing a lot of activity and you're not eating the appropriate amount of carbohydrates, because it's the carbohydrates that fuel anaerobic exercise. So let's say you're going for a 30-minute run, a 60-minute run, something pretty vigorous like that, and you don't have enough calories, you don't have enough carbohydrates, your muscles literally start breaking down to form the ATP for energy. So your body is literally feeding on itself to feed itself. And what happens then is you're lowering your metabolism and you're creating some more problems. If you were to stop running or whatever, you're going to gain weight more easily, not because you quit running, although that could be part of it, but also because you lowered your metabolism by losing muscle mass. So for those people that think they're doing themselves a favor trying to lose weight by cutting their carbs, you're actually harming yourself. We don't need high carb. We don't need high anything. We need the appropriate number. Your carbs are for energy. So if you have a highly active lifestyle, you're going to need more carbohydrates. If you have a low activity lifestyle, you don't need as many, but you don't need a low carb diet. All of our diet should be at least 50% carbohydrate. Endurance athletes should be closer to 70% of their diet. That's just a fact. Okay, so that's your little history on your metabolism. Now let's talk about your watch. How accurate is it? Well, again, comes down to it's an estimate. That's the best it can do, especially regarding your resting metabolic rate. When it tells you you're burning this much at rest, it's going to give you your total output at the end of the day, right? You already know your input if you're tracking it on MyFitnessPal. It's going to give you your total output at the end of the day based on an estimation of your resting metabolic rate and then your amount of activity. So the resting part is very, very, very guesstimated. Not quite sure how accurate that is. It's guesstimated. It's better than not knowing. I mean, that's for sure. Now, the active calories slightly better on some of the activities. On running and walking, it's pretty accurate because it is using a metabolic calculation that's been used for years, and this one is based on body weight. So this is slightly different from the RMR, which affects or is impacted by your muscle mass. The running and walking one is based on a metabolic calculation based on your weight and how far you're going, how fast you're going. So that is pretty darn accurate. So for example, when you run or walk a mile, you're basically going to burn on the average, a little higher for heavier people, a little bit lower for lighter people, but on the average about 130 calories a mile. And yes, a mile is a mile is a mile. Whether you walk a mile or run a mile, you're going to burn the same amount of calories, plus or minus 10%. That's just a fact. Why, you wonder? Well, think about it. Let's say you're a fairly fast runner, so you cover that mile in 7 minutes. That's not very long. Let's say then you walk that mile. Well, it takes you 14 minutes. So the intensity is lower, but it took you longer. You burn roughly the same amount of calories. So the walking and running, the weight-bearing exercise on these smartwatches is a pretty good, accurate number for expenditure. Cycling, not so much because it doesn't know what kind of bike you have, right? I mean, I'm sure there are some watches you could program, but it doesn't know if you have a nice triathlon bike, 18 speeds, aerodynamic, blah, 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 or you're simply covering the same distance on a beach cruiser with one gear. It doesn't know, right? So it's going to be based somewhere in the middle. So when it says, like with mine, I'll go down to the NSB Edgewater Trail and do anywhere from, say, 25 miles to 50 miles. And let's say in a 25 mile, in a 75 minutes or whatever it takes me, it says I burn like 900 calories. It's like, I doubt it. I mean, I have a aerodynamic triathlon bicycle, it's got all the gearing, it's aero, it's light. I doubt I burn that much. So that's going to be an estimate at best. Now, if you're on a beach cruiser and you cover that distance, time and all that, probably pretty good. So with the bicycling, you're going to have to go with the fact that it's a guesstimate at best and not an overly great one. Swimming's pretty good, kind of like running. It's going to be maybe a little bit more accurate. But really, the best one as far as calorie burn goes is going to be walking and running, and the others are guesstimates, okay? Another note on that. When you're strength training, it really shouldn't matter how many calories you're burning. That's secondary. The important part with strength training, which is a complete anaerobic exercise, the goal of strength training is to not burn a lot of calories. So sometimes us trainers get frustrated because people will be fiddling with their watches during the workout, and it's like, that's not really the point. It's great to get a little extra caloric burn, and we actually do some things in the workout to increase caloric burn, like do it in a circuit, keep moving, but the goal of strength training is to work the muscles close to failure. So you want to get to fatigue on certain exercises, and that's the goal of strength training. It's to create a greater afterburn afterwards, which means that when you go anaerobic and train hard, your muscles are going to be repaired as soon as you stop. Basically, the repair process starts and doesn't complete for the next day or so, 24, 48 hours during sleep. But the repair process begins where you start to heal those tiny little micro tears. That's going to create greater caloric burn. That's not raising your metabolism. That's called afterburn, EPOC, excess post-oxygen consumption. So there is a greater amount of recovery involved after breaking the muscles down, burning more calories. That's the goal, to strength train to the point where you are causing little micro tears. That's not supposed to sound scary. That's supposed to be what we're doing. Tiny little micro tears in the muscle by training with intensity, not to burn calories. The goal is to get stronger and work to fatigue. Sure, put your watch on during strength training. That's great. But don't overly fiddle with it or get too concerned about your caloric burn. You're not going to burn as many calories strength training as you are running. You're just not going to. That's just not the way it works. It's not as stressful on your cardiovascular system or on your metabolic system either. Okay? So, Smartwatch 101, it can definitely help. It's a good tool. Remember that the RMR is a guesstimate. The walking and running is pretty darn good. The cycling is not so good. The swimming is average, okay. Strength training, it's not the point. All right, so I hope you're keeping notes on all that. The most important thing I think I want you to get out of this today is how important strength training is for raising your metabolism. If you're just trying to lose weight via, eating better, that's great. Doing your cardio, moving, that's great. But the goal is to lose weight and keep it off. And the best way we can do that is as we're losing weight, strength train to keep the metabolic rate up. All right? That's the deal. So now, speaking of all those good foods, let me thank Istanbul Turkish Mediterranean Cuisine. They have great salads, vegetarian options. They're right here in Ormond Beach, Florida at 488 South Young Street. They can be reached at 386-492-7100. Until next time, be max fit, be max well.